And I'd like to introduce today's featured presenters. We have Dr. Steve Kaminsky, Chief Science Officer at RettSyndrome.org, and Dr. Janice Ascano, Grants Manager at RettSyndrome.org. And in the interest of time, I will turn the screen controls over to Dr. Kaminsky.
And Paige, let's see, show my screen.
There we go.
All right,
and
I will get, go ahead, Paige.
Okay, and now we can begin. Thanks, Steve.
All right, so I'm going to actually go to my first slide, and I want to essentially just go over the purpose of this presentation. And I want you all to recognize that I'm talking to a wall. So I usually talk to live audiences, and talking to a wall is a very, very different format for me. So bear with me. It's the first time I've talked to a wall. So the purpose of the presentation is really to understand the importance of clinical trials and for you to actually understand what to expect if you decide to join a clinical trial, and to inform you as families what questions you might ask when considering entering a clinical trial. And lastly, understand the demands of participating. All of these are really important for you to understand as you move forward. Now, some of the listeners have actually participated in clinical trials, and all of you who have, I salute you. You are true pioneers, because in many ways I want you to remember that there are two groups of pioneers when they're doing clinical trials. One, the scientists, the clinical physicians doing the science, but two, the participants. And it takes both to essentially dance this very complex tango of clinical trials. So those of you who have participated, I salute you. So what is clinical drug research? So this is a very basic talk because I want all of the families to understand exactly what goes on when we're talking about clinical trials. So first of all, most importantly, it involves humans. Now, any of the potential drugs that we're actually testing in humans have actually gone through animal models, and these are called preclinical studies, and they are often just as rigorous as the clinical trials that you are participating in. So those preclinical studies, the goal of those are to gain essentially the preliminary evidence that the targets that are being targeted by the specific drugs are that the drugs are safe and effective before we ever take one of these drugs into humans. And a very important piece that oftentimes that's overlooked is that in any clinical trial, the regulatory bodies in this country and in Europe actually ask that the drug manufacturers take their drugs into healthy volunteers first. So this is oftentimes forgotten, that many times the drug has been given to the age group normal people, and it's usually on the order of probably about 10 people, just to see how those people with normal biology respond to the drug, and to identify any potential any potential side effects and what the effective doses might be. So it's an important piece to remember that any of those drugs that are out there have been given to healthy volunteers. Now, in regard to more questions about clinical drug research, in this case, the Department of Health and Human Services, and in particular in the United States, the NIH and the FDA, require that there is informed consent before anybody can enter a trial. And to add to that, the Department of Health and Human Services has actually identified what are called vulnerable populations. And vulnerable populations, for all of your information, there's three basic groups who are considered vulnerable. One are prisoners. You can no longer do clinical trials on prisoners because they're vulnerable. They're incarcerated, and in incarceration they might feel they have to participate, so you can't do anything with prisoners. You cannot do anything with soldiers because they are essentially under command, and under command they might again feel that they have to sign a consent form. So you cannot do research with prisoners, soldiers, and the third vulnerable population is children. And so children, you have to be very, very careful when working with children because children may not understand informed consent. So that leads me to the second bullet. If the participant is unable to give informed consent, it becomes essential that the parent or guardian give informed consent before that individual can enter a trial. So with this third vulnerable population, and you can all understand how that applies to children and adults with Rett syndrome, they are vulnerable because of the inability to actually ask them for the informed consent. So it comes down to the parent or guardian in regard to that informed consent. And when a parent or guardian actually gives informed consent, they have to understand what all of that means. And that's what we hope to bring forward today. So why participate in clinical research? You know, many people look at clinical research saying, I'll be getting advanced treatment. But I always caution people that's not what clinical research is. You're not getting the latest, greatest advanced treatment. But I want everyone to remember that that clinical research is just that, research. And that research may show that the treatment that's under investigation is not effective. So you may not see any benefit by this. And that's why, you know, I think it's really important for people to remember that what you're doing is you're participating with the idea that you have the opportunity to help advance the development of a treatment that it could improve a particular condition. So again, going back to my opening statements, participants are pioneers. They're essentially blazing ground for all of those people who are affected with a condition. They're blazing the path for them. So how is participating in a clinical trial different from going and seeing your physician? So all of you take your children, take yourself, spouses, to the physician, and when you go to the physician, what you're going for is for that physician to provide the best in practice care for you. But if you're going to enter a clinical trial, what you're doing when you enter a clinical trial is it's all about improving the best of practice. So I think that's a very important aspect for us all to remember. Now in Rett, we have a lot of different treatments for different symptoms with Rett, whether it's seizures, breathing, but remember those are essentially treatments for symptoms. If we want to improve the biology, we are essentially blazing new ground because we don't have treatments for Rett to correct the biology of Rett. So I'm going to jump into the phases of clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. So you all heard these terms, and as you follow all of the work that's being done, you'll see phase 1 trial was safe and effective, phase 2 trial is safe, effective, and effective. So the challenge is, what does all this mean? So a phase 1 trial is usually a very small trial, oftentimes 10 subjects or less, with the primary goal just to evaluate whether something is safe, tolerated, and are there any potential side effects. Now, this is a little bit different than the phase 1 that I talked about at the very beginning that goes into healthy subjects to prove whether or not it has any side effects on a healthy subject. That same drug that has no ill effects on a healthy subject may actually have some side effects on a subject that's compromised. So the phase 1 is almost always repeated when you go into working with a particular disorder. So phase 1s are small. Primary goal, is it safe, is it tolerated, and are there any potential side effects? If everything comes out fine, they can move to a phase 2. Now remember, in all of these phases, you are usually working with the FDA because the thing that most investigators have actually meet and work with the FDA before they start their trial many times. In a phase 2, if you've had a successful phase 1, you want more insight into that drug, and you want to know, is it effective? So in the phase 2, it's designed to gain more insight into safety and tolerability, but at the same time, you're trying to evaluate whether it's effective and will change the course of the disorder. And the number of participants for a phase 2 is usually, in a rare disease like Rett syndrome, is anywhere between 20 and 50, depending on how your power, what you're trying to do with outcome measures. And again, this is where investigators are very, very forward-looking if they sit with the FDA and talk about that before they ever actually take their trial to the clinic. Phase 3, this is where the rubber meets the road. So you've had a successful phase 1, you've had a successful phase 2, and now you go to phase 3. And phase 3 in the vernacular is the pivotal trial. If you have a successful phase 3, that's when you can sit with the FDA and start to write a new drug application. And after that, that's when scripts can be written for this drug. So that the challenge with phase 3 is that they are larger studies, larger in number, and often more than one site. And you might ask, well, why do they have to do it at more than one site? And the reason they do it at more than one site is to take investigator bias out. One investigator may see something that another investigator doesn't see. And so by doing it at multiple sites, you get the benefit of multiple clinical investigators looking at the outcome measures. And the FDA, for phase 3 pivotal studies, almost always asks for a multi-site trial. And if the phase 3 is successful, then it turns to the drug company and says, okay, you're free to do phase 4. People are writing script for it, but that doesn't mean that the drug company and the FDA aren't evaluating what's going on in each of the cases where the drug is administered. And when the phase 4 is done, the FDA finally approves it as a new treatment. But phase 4 is almost always at the expense of the particular drug company that's working on with that particular drug. Now, many people across the last couple of years have asked me about placebo controls. You know, I want to get in the trial, but I don't want the placebo. But actually, to make the study valid, all of the studies today have to have a control group that's blinded and randomly selected. So no one knows who's going to be selected to be in the control group. The physician doesn't know, the patient doesn't know, but it's the standard of care for clinical trials. Now, placebos can be replaced by standard of care, and let me use an example of diabetes here. So if I've developed a new drug for diabetes, when I go to do a diabetes trial, the FDA is not going to essentially ask me to do a placebo control. They're going to ask me to go against the standard of care, which could be any different number of forms of insulin therapy that is out there. So I'm being compared against the best procedure out there. And the FDA only wants to give a new script if, in fact, I can make if my drug is better than the standard of care. So it's important for you to know that if there's a standard of care out there, that can serve as a placebo. Now, in Rett syndrome, as you all know, we don't have a standard of care in regard to pharmacological approach to change the biology of Rett. So in the case of Rett, all of the clinical trials that I'll talk about at the end do have placebo controls as recommended by the FDA. So who can participate in clinical trials? Well, anybody can participate in clinical trials, but you need to understand the eligibility criteria if you want to essentially participate. And eligibility criteria comes in two forms. That criteria, which are called inclusion criteria, which allows, those are all the things that somebody must have to participate, and the exclusion criteria, and those are all the things that will disqualify somebody from participating. And you might ask yourself, well, why are there inclusion and exclusion criteria? And the reason is that the scientists are trying to get the most uniform population of patients that they can get. So they can obviously see the changes that a particular drug brings to a uniform population of patients, as opposed to a widely dispersed population of patients. Then you don't, if it's a widely dispersed population of patients, you might not know, is it the drug or is it some other challenge that the individual patient has. So in order to try to control that, the designers of clinical trials, they actually spend hours looking at what inclusion criteria they will have and what exclusion criteria they will have. And so one of the questions that has come up to Paige and Jennifer and myself is, how come there's no boys in the trials? And the challenge with boys is that the gender difference in regard to Rett, it's a very different set of biological conditions. And it would be very hard to make a solid set of conclusions when with girls, they are essentially heterozygous in regard to mutations, whereas the boys are hemizygous. So in this case, the inclusion criteria or exclusion criteria tries to essentially narrow down the population. So in fact, the scientists can make hard conclusions on the observations they made, on the treatments they delivered, and the observations that followed those treatments. So for you as families who might want to participate in trials, I'm always telling you, please ask questions. Your responsibility is to question that research team. And I've listed some questions that you might ask, and I think this is not the whole list. You should, again, there are many more, but this is a type of question. What are the risks to my child? How might it help my child? What are the possible side effects? Is there a possibility that we might receive a placebo? Will the study change the current medication regime my child's on? What test will be involved with the trial? Will blood or tissues be collected? Do I have to participate in those tissue collections? Will there be discomfort to my child? How long will this study last? What happens if there's side effects? Who's going to take care of my child if I'm not there? Has the study been assessed by an institutional review board? And today, that question is almost always yes, but you should always still ask it and make sure that you know that whose institutional review board was it. Can I withdraw at any time? And will the physician support me if I decide to withdraw? Will there be continuing, will we be able to continue receiving experimental medicine after the trial? It's a great question, but it oftentimes depends on whether that drug already has an FDA approval or not. A new experimental drug oftentimes cannot be used in that regard. So, and how does this research help the field? All of these are just a sample of the type of questions you should be asking, and don't be afraid to ask them. The physicians, if they're not willing to answer it, I would say that that's not the trial you want to be in. Physicians should answer all of these type of questions, and if they're not willing to answer those type of questions, I'm not sure I would participate in that kind of trial. And remember, this is for you as well as your children. If you decide to go into this kind of trial or that kind of trial, these are the kind of things you need to ask. Informed consent. Since we're working with, and many times in regard to vulnerable population, parents and caregivers are the ones who actually are going to be signing informed consent. So you really have to read it and understand it. You, as the signatory, have to know the risks and the benefits. You want to make sure there's confidentiality. Make sure you know where the study is being carried out and how many visits you're going to have to make to the site, and whether or not you're going to have any costs associated with any of that, or is all of your costs going to be covered. Those are important questions. Will you have access to new information? And if the information is that they have uncovered some risks or benefits, are they making sure that you are informed of those risks and benefits as the study proceeds? And once the study is complete, what information will come back to you? These are all important things that you should be able to get out of the informed consent. Now, informed consents are approved by the institutional review boards of every place that's conducting clinical trials. And they have readers who make sure that they're at the level of English or Spanish, depending on your language, that people with normal educations can understand, read these and understand them. So make sure you read them. They might be a couple pages long, but it is worth your while to read it, understand it, and don't sign it if you don't understand everything on there. Children's rights. This is really important. Children have rights when they can communicate, and they have to be heard. So if a child says, I don't want to do this, the physician and family members have to consider and respect what that child says. Children cannot be forced to provide reasons for their objections. And it's important for all of us to understand this. This is the most vulnerable population. The Office of Human Protection takes these criteria very seriously, and any institution who doesn't abide by this actually can be faulted and cited. Now the challenge is with Rett, our children, many of them do have means of communication, whether it's through Toby or other devices that are out there. So the question is, how can you do this with your child? And I think it's something that you as parents have to essentially address and come to grips with as you're moving down the road if you're thinking about clinical trials. Now, some of your children are so young that maybe you can't have this, and then you're taking on the full responsibility. But I put this up because I think it's important to know how the Office of Human Protection sees children in clinical trials. Now, what to remember, you can always withdraw. No one can tell you you can't withdraw. You can always withdraw. You should always ask questions whenever they arise. And the thing that I constantly am talking to parents about is that clinical trials are not a form of individual medical therapy. It is medical research, and that medical research has the possibility of being successful or not being successful. And so, again, I come back to you are trailblazers when you actually start down the road of clinical trials. Now, I'm going to very quickly go through 7 clinical trials that are up on clinicaltrials.gov when you actually type in Rett syndrome. Now, about 28 will come up, but these are the active ones. 2 of these have actually just closed, number 2 and number 7. But I'm going to put these in my farmer upstate New York vernacular. So we have essentially 4 of these compounds, IGF-1, NNZ-2566, fingolimod, and Copaxone, all in a category that I call enhancing growth. Copaxone and fingolimod actually stimulate BDNF in the brain, and IGF-1 and NNZ-2566 essentially work through BDNF pathway. So 4 of them actually cause essentially growth, if you will, new dendrites, new spines, and possibly new synapses to form. So think about this from the standpoint of these 4 compounds are designed to attack Rett biology by essentially making more networks, making more connections. Remember, think of our girls from the standpoint, and boys, that they have 100 billion neurons, just like all of us. The difference between their neurons and our neurons is that we have 40 to 50,000 connections per neuron, and they have probably about 1/3 of that. So what these 4 compounds are doing is essentially making more connections, more wires, better wires, more wires, so more networks can form. The next category of compounds, number 3, dysperamine, and number 5, dextromethorphan, those are essentially affecting the purity of the signals between the wires, if you will. So those 2 essentially are affecting the signal strength at the level of the synapse and helping to make better and more pure signals. And the final one, Edison's EPI 743, is an oxidative stress reducer. And what that is doing in my example is essentially just helping with energy metabolism. So I want you to think back to MECP2 and what it does. It has a lot of downstream effects. One is that the neurons don't form as many synapses. Another is that the signals aren't as nice and clean. And another is that the neurons just don't look as healthy. So IGF-1, NNZ, 2566, fingolimod, and Copaxone are helping with the number of connections. Dysparame, Dextromethorphan are helping with the purity of signal, and the EPI 743 is just a nice housekeeper. It makes the cell more energy efficient. It makes the cell happier, if you will. So those are the 7 compounds that are out there in clinical trials at clinicaltrials.gov. And now I'm just going to run through them very quickly. Dysparame, that clinical trial is taking place in France. It's a phase 2 trial. It's an inhibitor of norepinephrine reuptake. That trial has a placebo, a low dose, and a high dose, and their primary outcome measure is looking for changes in respiration, and that's due to end this year. They're not accepting any more patients into that trial, so they're finishing it up at this point. The fingolimod is a trial in Switzerland under Novartis. Again, it stimulates BDNF. It's a phase 1 safety and tolerability in 6 patients for 12 months. They just started, and it's supposed to run for 2 years. The dextromethorphan is taking place at Hopkins. And remember, dextromethorphan quiets down the NMDA receptor, which is overactive in Rett. It's a phase 2 trial enrolling about 60 patients, ages 1 to 10. And the trial started in 13, and it's scheduled to end this year. The Copaxone trial is taking place in 2 countries, Israel and the United States at Montefiore. In Israel, it's a safety study with 10 girls at Montefiore. It's an efficacy trial with 20 girls, and with the outcome measure in that efficacy study looking at gait and other aspects of gait. And remember, this is, again, a BDNF stimulator. The trials just started, and they're due to end this year. EPI 743 is hosted by Edison. It was a phase 2 trial held in Italy. It ended in 14. 743 is a compound that reduces oxidative stress. It helps with the energy metabolism in the cell. It was found to be safe. And it did have a positive effect in the younger patients that were in that trial by causing an increase in the circumference of head circumference. And all of you know from the natural history study that the circumference actually falls off the normal curve. And so this is a interesting study in that if, in fact, those healthier cells help with something like head circumference, what's going on with networks? I know that Edison is working with the FDA right now for a possible next step and most likely a phase 2 study here in the States. The IGF-1 study that has been taking place up at Boston's under Dr. Kaufman, IGF-1 is a growth enhancer. The phase 1 study has been completed and published, and that was safe and tolerable. They're in the phase 2 study. It's a double-blind, crossover, placebo control. And I'll explain that very quickly. Double-blind, crossover, placebo control means that everybody sees the placebo in the study, everybody sees the drug. Half of the patients will get the drug, half of the patients will get the placebo. They'll get the drug and the placebo for a certain amount of time. When that time ends, they wash out, they are taking nothing, and at a given time following that, they then get the other thing that they didn't have. So everybody sees placebo, everybody sees the drug. Nice design, and that one is essentially still going on, probably will be over in the next 12 to 15 months. The NNZ-2566 trial, now called trofinetide, was done at Baylor, UAB, Gillette. It's a growth enhancer as well as an anti-inflammatory, and most of you have probably followed all of the publications on this. This actually, they chose a very, very steep hill to climb because the FDA, because of the normal phase 1 testing of the drug was done in adults, the FDA said you need to work in adult women with Rett, and so that's what they did. And it was a phase 2 placebo control with a high dose, low dose. The study was completed, safe and effective. In 14, it received fast track status. Earlier this year, orphan drug status. Last week, they didn't get their breakthrough therapy status, but the FDA is very interested on the next steps. I know NERN is working with them as we speak. Now, I'm going to stop there, and Paige, if you want to throw questions at me that have come in, I'm happy to take them.
Great. Thank you, Steve. If anyone has questions right now for Steve Kaminsky, go ahead and type them into your questions chat box. I do have one from a parent who asked, let's see, I signed it to you, about the criteria for a period of stability in a clinical trial, pointing out that for her daughter, there has never been a period longer than 3 months at any one time of stability. So they were curious if you knew any more of a definition of what that meant.
Oh, good question. I don't know because, again, it would actually depend on talking with the physicians actually conducting that particular trial for me to actually interpret what they mean by that. Do they mean stability from the standpoint of out of regression or so it's a very hard one to interpret without having the particular physicians who designed that experiment actually answer that.
That's
I
right.
apologize for not knowing, but if I knew which trial it was, I could go and talk with the physicians and do some interpretation of that.
Sure. I think that I have a little bit of experience in knowing that one. I believe it's the IGF-1 trial. The Increlex trial at Boston, and I know that's part of the pre-screening process. So if you're interested in participating in almost any clinical trial, there's almost always a pre-screening you go through over the phone with the researcher and probably a mail print questionnaire to help establish that. Any investigator doing a clinical trial with Rett syndrome knows that there's a period of instability and that some change they may be referring specifically to that trial.
Sure.
So hopefully that clarifies. Trial that's not taking place in your own area. So if your child with Rett syndrome lives in one state or country, but you wish to participate in a trial held elsewhere, is there anything that would be a barrier for you traveling to that location?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good question. Many of the trials are actually restricted in that regard. So a trial in the United States might only be able to take participants in the United States. Sometimes they get opened up to other countries, but again, that's each trial you have to essentially ask that question of the actual site that's conducting that trial. So take, for example, the trial in Switzerland. Could a family here in the States go over and participate in that? I don't know the answer because I don't know the regulatory rules of the country. But there are regulatory rules, and oftentimes it's very hard to move across international boundaries when you're participating in trials. But it has been done. So the question is, you have to ask and see what the answer is. But I don't think a general statement will cover us on that regard. I think it's going to be you ask about each specific trial if you are looking to participate wherever it is.
Great. Okay, ready for the next question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we have a question from Canada about, sorry, couldn't help but making a little Canadian accent comment. We have a new Rett syndrome registry in Canada. Any idea when some of these studies will come to Canada?
Yeah, great question. I think, again, this will actually depend on two things. One, the sponsor of the trials, as well as the pharmaceutical company. The sponsor, in the case of RettSyndrome.org or RSRT, they could say, we want to do the trial in Toronto and in New York. We want to do the trial, but they have to essentially get the physicians involved to actually make those declarations. And so the sponsor can help in that regard. The drug company can also help in that regard. But remember, all of it costs money, and everybody has to essentially decide, okay, how can we get the most data in regard to our investment? Excuse me. So the challenge in taking a trial any place, even multiple sites within the States or multiple sites within Canada, is making sure that each site has the requisite team on the ground to do the kind of measurements and the kind of observations that need to be done for that trial. And so that involves a lot of training, so everybody is on the same page. And that's where it becomes, especially in a phase 2 trial, which is an efficacy trial and the smaller, it's a very expensive venture to do that. The phase 3, you're going to have to do multiple sites. The FDA will actually demand it from the standpoint of investigator bias. So the challenge will be, where are the teams that have the requisite skill set to do that study? And that becomes essentially the coin of the realm.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. We have another question specific to the Neurin trial for trofinetide. So this has got multiple parts to it. I'm going to kind of merge in a couple of questions specifically about that trial. So for that study, will they now go to phase 3 for adults? When will they do the study for children? And the NNZ was done with women with Rett in the process going forward, will there be more studies using girls, women of younger ages? And if it begins in children, will they have to go back to start at phase 1 with a pediatric population for that particular trial?
Okay. I think the way I'll answer it, I'll touch all of that. So the next phase for Neurin is they could actually go to the FDA and say, let's do a phase 3 right now in adults, but that's not going to happen because they really want to essentially treat younger and younger. So I think in my talking with the scientists at Neurin, their next steps are, as they work with the FDA, to essentially do a pediatric trial with 2566, with trofinetide. And the pediatric trial would be very similar to the first trial in the adult women. And so it would be another supportive trial, a phase 2 trial, probably very similar numbers, placebo, low dose, high dose. And if they, again, get positive effects, then they can go back to the FDA and say, now let's do a pivotal phase 3 study, and they can open up the age range from as young as they did the pediatric trial all the way up to 46 as they did in the adult trial. So they can essentially cover their bases by doing it this way. So I suspect that their next step with the FDA would be a phase 2 pediatric trial. If successful, move to the pivotal phase 3 trial, which they can essentially now blanket a much larger age spectrum. I'll stop there, Paige.
Great. Okay. Now I'd like to mention that we hope that for our next webinar that we will be able to invite the researchers who are hosting and sponsoring the Neurin trofinetide trial to speak directly to our community about their plans, but they're not quite ready to be able to speak with our community. But as soon as they have clearance to do so, we will set up a webinar and let them answer your questions directly. We have another question about the next stages of the IGF-1, and it may be the same situation. We'll have to wait until we can speak with the investigators, but you might know the answer to this one, Steve. The question is, are the girls participating in the trial now the only ones who will be able to participate in the next phases, or will it open up to new participants?
It will open up to new participants. And Walter is still recruiting. We had a meeting with the FDA 2 or 3 weeks ago. The FDA made some suggestions. Walter saluted sharply, said, "I love the suggestions." And so, if you're interested, contact Walter. He's still recruiting.
Great. Okay, and Dr. Ascano is going to take us on a journey into our website in a few minutes to show us where you can find information about contacting these investigators. But we do have a couple more questions. Steve, if you can bear with us. Okay, so we have another question that says, it sounds like many of the clinical trials are getting towards the end. Are any new clinical trials in the works, or must we wait for phase 2 trials to begin?
I think there's a large number of drugs that are still out there going through preclinical, as well as some groups that are getting ready to do other clinical trials. I've heard Sasha Ducek talk about ketamine as a possible coming up, which is comes out of a paper that David Katz published in 13. There's a number. If you go back and study the literature on reversals in Rett mice, there's been about 17 of them, and some of those drugs are moving forward through the very stringent preclinical network and getting ready to jump into clinical trials. And they will be possibly phase 1s and phase 2s, but again, all of the phases are out there to protect the participants, and that's what the FDA's job is to make sure no undue harm comes to anybody. There is one thing I'd like to say, and that is all of these trials, all 7 that I talked about, are super. They're super because every one of them is chasing down Rett biology. Now, is it a cure? No, it's not a cure, but it's changing Rett biology. And if we can change Rett biology step by step, we may be able to help with network formation within our Rett population. Network formation is essentially the coin of the realm from the standpoint of if you have a new network, you can fire and wire that network and build new neurologic responses. And so I want everybody to recognize that there's no magic bullet, no matter what you actually use, whether it's gene therapy, whether it's RNA mechanisms, any of these downstream mechanisms. The idea is that you'll be able to correct biology, but then you have to fire and wire that neurology. And so it's 2 steps, and that's why Dr. Ascano and I have been pushing not only correcting biology, but also correcting the neurobiology and actually trying to fire and wire better, quicker, faster, using new, different types of physical therapy, occupational therapy, cognitive therapy. It's going to take both barrels of that shotgun, the drug and the neurohabilitation, to essentially get those networks working the way everybody would like them to work. Paige, I'll stop there and let Janice take over.
Okay, thank you. And I do have a listing of all the questions that have been asked by chat. So if we didn't get to your question or we run out of time today, we will be doing a text summary, and we'll get Dr. Kaminsky and Dr. Ascano to answer the rest of your questions, and we will send it out to all participants. Okay, so at this time, we go ahead and turn over the screen to Dr. Ascano. Thank you so much, Steve. And I'd like to introduce Janice Ascano, who's the grants manager at rettsyndrome.org and is responsible for putting all this information up on our website and staying in very close contact with our sponsored investigators and funded investigators. Janice, are you ready to go?
Yes. Thanks, Paige. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Janice Ascano. I'm the grants manager at RettSyndrome.org. I work closely with Dr. Kaminsky, and I usually interface with just the scientists and clinicians who are hard at work at accelerating research for Rett syndrome. But I want to take a moment and just say that I do work with all the other staff members, and we put out a lot of resources, and that's what I'm going to cover in the next few minutes. Basically, I hope you'll find this webinar series as a great resource. Paige mentioned that it is being recorded now, and we will find a location for it on our website. So with that, I'm going to start off with our resources, and I just have a few slides. Let me just close this a little bit. So our major resource here I want to highlight is our website. It's the place that you'll find information on the clinical trials, the latest news, our funded research projects, family empowerment resources. I encourage you to click through the website at your convenience, and please feel free to give us feedback. But for today, I want to point out two places to help you navigate to content that pertains to today's webinar. First, there is a webpage dedicated to clinical trials, and you'll find that under the tab for families. I hope you can see my arrow here. So under this clinical trials webpage, we list detailed information about the clinical trials that we sponsor that Steve briefly mentioned. But we also wanted to point out a very important site that Steve also mentioned, which is called clinicaltrials.gov, which is located up here. So it's a government website that's maintained by the National Library of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health. We encourage you to visit this database and search the term Rett syndrome. There you're going to find even more details on other approved Rett syndrome clinical trials. You can find out information about inclusion and exclusion criteria and outcome measures, and where the study is being taken place, and whether it's an open and recruiting trial. And in some cases, you'll find results of the clinical trial published. But for Rett syndrome, there's very few of those. So back to our family tab here. The other resource that I wanted to point out today is something here. You can click on resources under families, and it'll take you, let's see if it works here. Sorry, I'm having tough, can't seem to move forward. 1 second. Paige, if you're on, can you help me move forward?
Let's see. Why don't we change, I'll change over to my screen.
Okay, great.
And
I don't know why it froze.
I don't know. Technology is our friend. Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah, so let me flip forward real fast. Were you?
I was right there. Great. Thank you. So
okay,
again, to navigate through our website, you go from for families to resources, and I wanted to highlight this document that you can download. It's for today's webinar. We have this corresponding booklet. It's called A Participant's Guide to Drug Research in Rett Syndrome. It covers everything that was presented today in written detail, and this booklet was developed some time ago when we started funding two of these clinical trials, and our community has many, many questions about what participation involves, so we created this booklet for you to download. And sometimes it's difficult to find, so that's why I've highlighted it here. Paige, if you want to advance one, great. I wanted to point out our blog that we created for RettSyndrome.org. It's located under our role and impact off of the main menu. We strive to bring you more information for translating the latest research news that comes out, for family empowerment and caregiving and support, and for other RettSyndrome.org developments. We encourage you to read these blogs, and if you have questions or want to see a particular topic covered, please let us know. And we also publish these blogs through our social media outlets such as Facebook and Twitter. On our next slide, if page could advance, you will see a screenshot of our YouTube channel for RettSyndrome.org. We have a bunch of videos that we've collected and hosted under this YouTube channel. It includes interviews as well as presentations made at the family conference. And as you know by now, it includes many great presentations from our Chief Science Officer, Dr. Kaminsky, explaining all about research strategies at RettSyndrome.org. And now that brings me to my final slide. Oops. This is our final resource slide. We hope that you find that we are your resources. Again, here's our contact information. Please email us if you have any questions, and we will definitely respond. Again, thanks for listening. In the interest of time, I think we have about 8 minutes. There might be many more questions. I'll let Paige take over and look at the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice. And I will scroll through and see if we have any new questions here. We do have a continuing thread of questions about the trofinetide study. Okay, so Dr. Kaminsky, if you can answer this question. A couple of different parents have asked if there will be additional sites considered for the next phase of the Neuron trial when that comes out, and if there would be potentially a site in Australia, given that that's where the company headquarters is.
Yeah, sure. I can't answer that question. That's really a decision that Neuron will be making. I think that they may expand their sites. I've had some preliminary discussions with them. And again, remember the challenge is training the physicians at those sites to collect the data in a way that the trial is designed around. So each day of training costs lots of money. And so the challenge is just that. But I'm pretty sure that they right now are looking at the 3 sites that they did the first trial on, if those 3 sites agree to continue. But they are also entertaining other sites. I've made some suggestions, and I will continue to make suggestions, so the number of sites may grow. But remember, the number of patients that they'll need for that is probably about the same. And if you think back to how many women were in the first trial, it was a little over 50. So, and again, in this regard, the more sites you have, the quicker you can do it, the quicker your outcome is. And so they're all up for speed. And so if we can identify additional sites that can be up and running very quickly, I think they'll be more than happy to do that. And I'm working with them in that regard all the time. So hopefully yes is the answer, and that will speed things up.
Great. Families are also asking if we have an idea of when the published results of what improvements were seen during the first phases of the trial will be available for the public to review.
Yeah, so that won't take place until after there's been extensive review with the FDA. And the reason for that is essentially intellectual property. And again, pharmaceutical industries hold the intellectual property. That's their key to their future, and their boards are very protective of that. So as soon as they are finished with the FDA has said, "Oh, we like that, we like that, we like that," I'm pretty sure there'll be a clinical trial paper that comes out on it. But I can't tell you when, because I know they're working with scheduling the meeting with the FDA right now. Actually, there were conversations yesterday in this regard, but I don't know when the date is set yet.
Okay, fantastic. And as I mentioned, we will try to hold a webinar with the researchers conducting this trial as soon as they do have that approval, so that you can ask all of these questions directly of those researchers. Now, in the interest of time, we have 2 other topics that have come up in our thread that I would like to give you a few minutes to answer before we conclude for the day. One is on neurohabilitation, and one is on males with Rett syndrome or MECP2 mutations. So let's start with the first one with boys, and we do have a parent who has a son with Rett syndrome or a MECP2 mutation, I'm not sure which, and they're just very curious to know if there is anything in the works for this set of children.
I don't know of anybody who's planning a trial, but here's what I would anticipate, is that if, in fact, let's say we have a pivotal trial that proves to be effective with the girls, I think then script can be written to actually use it in males. So I'm hopeful that that's the route that we would be able to go, because I think it would be very difficult to do a clinical trial with males alone that would actually have the power that the FDA would actually would sanction. So I think that it's going to fall into proving something works with the girls, and then have compassionate use clause for the boys. That's what I predict will happen, and that's what I will push in that regard. Does that help, Paige?
Thank you. I think that's a great answer. And okay, so the last set of questions that I'd like for you to talk about today is about the neurohabilitation. So parents are asking that, you know, it seems like it will be a while for the drug trials to conclude and for these drugs to come to market. So they're curious about any potential therapeutic clinical trials on the horizon are being conducted, and if those types of trials would have to go through the same phases or the same process as a drug clinical trial. And if we do discover any neurohabilitation technologies or interventions that are effective, will those be quicker to market, if you will, than a drug?
Great question. Yes. So let me answer it from the standpoint that Janice and I introduced a program last year. We funded 6 investigators to do neurohabilitation research. If those investigators find, and those are many of them are doing sort of phase 1, phase 2 trials in what they're doing, they would then actually have to take that for approval, and it might be device approval with the FDA. Device versus drugs, it's a different group at the FDA, and then take that forward to a larger trial to show that it is truly effective. So the FDA is out there not only monitoring drugs but also devices. I've been encouraging folks to read Norman Deutsch's book, his latest book. I also encourage you to read his first book, but the latest one is The Brain's Way of Healing. And there's a chapter in there, the 7th chapter, which talks about a device that was developed at some time ago called a portable stimulation neuromodulation, and the DoD has funded a large project with this to help wounded warriors rehabilitate quicker, faster, better who have had brain injury. And one of the things that I've been pushing is we need to try that in Rett syndrome. Now, it's not as easy as that from the standpoint of getting an investigator who's willing to try PONS, with Rett girls. So this is where we have to go out and push. But it's a device, and you'd have to go through all the device evaluations associated with the FDA as well. Same with new ways of using computer games. But again, that's the charge for us. We really need to essentially have these 2 different things on convergent evolution. The drugs, the family of drugs, combination of drugs, trying to essentially correct Rett biology, and then all of the new and various ways to do to essentially stimulate neuroplasticity and bring those to fruition in regard to Rett syndrome. So yes, Janice and I have a call right now, a second call, looking for more neurohabilitation and how we can accelerate neurohabilitation in Rett children, as opposed to what might be used in people who've been in car accidents or people who have other disabilities. So let's really focus on those, the biology around Rett, and how can we use neuroplasticity to our greatest advantage in regard to Rett. I'll stop there, Paige.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Okay, I'd like to thank you both so much for your time today. You've shared a lot of information. I'd like to remind our attendees that we have recorded this presentation, and a link will be sent for you to be able to access the recording and refer back to it, any questions. We will prepare a Q&A document to get answers out of every question that was asked that we didn't have time to get an answer for today. So never fear, we'll get your questions answered. And as Dr. Ascano said, we are always available to you by email, phone call, contact our foundation, and we're happy to have any conversations about clinical trials where we can. And if we don't have the answer, we are happy to connect you directly with the investigator conducting any of these trials. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I know we have attendees from all over the world with different time zones and different challenges with work and family, and your attendance today really shows your interest in our foundation and the world of Rett syndrome making advances for our children. And I want you to know that we're very sincere in our desire to help you with the issues you're dealing with today, as well as keeping you focused and hopeful about the research that's on the horizon. I know it doesn't always progress at the pace that we would all like, but it is progressing rapidly. And there are so many clinical trials happening right now that so many brave families are making the effort to put their children in to help all of our children. And I know many of you who are eager to participate. So we really want to thank you for that interest. I hope that this webinar format is helpful for our community, and we will bring additional topics both related to care and research. So keep an eye out on our calendars and our social media sites. Please sign up for our newsletters, and you'll be informed of all future webinar topics. And particularly mark your calendars for the week of June 22nd through 26th, where we will do a intense focus of live webinars, no cost. So very interested in making sure that you stay as possible. So thank you very much for attending today. We'll get the link out to the recording to you as possible, and we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, evening, or morning. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.